Hello? Hi, everybody. How are you doing? The lucky few who made it to the last session of the conference. Yeah? Well done. Thank you. Appreciate you. Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. Exactly. Are you guys staying for the dinner afterwards? No? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay. I just want to call on Jan Louis. Can you hear us, sir?
I can hear you. Sorry, I had a bit of a misunderstanding because I received the cancellation, but I will be able to join. I am available.
Okay, appreciate it. That's very good. So I'm going to do a round of intros, just so everybody knows who's who on the panel. We have Lunga Maloyi. So Lunga Maloyi is the Director of Economic Policy at BUSA, Business Unity of South Africa. And I'm introducing them, but I think I'm going to also give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, but I'm going to float them a question at the same time, just so everybody has context on the topic. Yeah? So we're looking at improving our logistics with an integrated rail system. Gents, if you wouldn't mind moving Mr. Jan on the left. Jan, please feel free if you want to engage, put your camera on. I think there's double sound. Okay, cool. So we have Lunga Maloyi, Director of Economic Policy at Business Unity South Africa. We also have Divisional Director from Value Logistics, Stephen Segal. Yes, Stephen Segal. 42 years experience in the logistics sector with specialities across the board. And Mr. Jan-Louis Spoelstra, ex-Transnet, but also current member, board member of the Interim Rail Economic Regulator. So very insightful voices today. I did try and get somebody from Transnet on panel. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it. Mesela, CEO of African Rail, was supposed to be with us today. Unfortunately, she is a little bit sick. So we're going to move ahead. And I'll tell you, this was a very exciting topic because up until 5 minutes ago, I actually changed my slide deck. Because after doing a little bit more research, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for the 7 of you here from this presentation that hopefully you guys can take back with you. Cool. So I said I will float a question to each of the panelists, and I'd really appreciate if they could give their sort of responses. What is the significance of an integrated rail system, and how do they make logistics more efficient within the network? Mr. Lunga, please, feel free.
Sure. Sorry, is it on? Thank you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sham said, my name is Lunga Maloyi. I'm Director responsible for Economic Policy. Currently, I work as part of the logistics team at BUSA under B4SA, which is the implementing arm of BUSA. We have been involved in a number of initiatives related to fixing some of the challenges within our logistics sector. And as part of that team, we then feed into a broader government-led initiative titled the National Logistics Crisis Committee. And my role there really is to drive some of the work that we're doing with regards to structural reform, particularly looking at the policy landscape and regulatory landscape and how that could serve as a catalyst or serve as an enabling environment or framework to crowd in private sector participation within the broader logistics network, but also particularly within rail. So part of the work that we've been doing and spearheading recently is about how do we begin to ensure that there's sufficient third-party access to the rail system to improve efficiencies within that system, but also to stop the rot that we have been seeing within the system as a whole. If you look back, for instance, to pre-COVID times, we used to move around 220 million tons worth of freight on our system. That is currently down to about 154. And excuse me, having done our own models, we believe that the freight system should be operating or moving freight anything above 220 million tons for it to be economically viable. And so it stands with no reason that we do need to see increased improvement within our logistics system. And one of the things that we need to really look at is to say how best do we ensure that there's a globally competitive integrated railway system within South Africa to respond not only to the demands of the economy, but also to ensure that we begin to turn around some of the challenges that we see there.
Awesome. Stephen?
Yeah, great. So my name's Stephen Segal. I'm the Director of the Clearing and Forwarding Division. I'm with a company called Value Logistics. Our big game is logistics. You know, I have a look and he says I've had 42 years experience, but it's a crazy thought that when the first containers were introduced in 1957, that's when I was born, so it's a long time ago. But I've seen a whole change within this industry. I've certainly seen since moving of containers, the whole way we move containers. And as a logistics company, obviously the way would be to move containers by road. But we have been engaging with Transnet Freight Rail in terms of moving containers by rail, and we find that over the years they have certainly improved, their service levels improved, and we advocate to other clearing agents, our clients, to go ahead and move from road to rail.
Thank you, Stephen. Jan, if you wouldn't mind adding in and perhaps maybe coloring in just some of the economic, potentially environmental benefits of rail over road.
Thank you very much. I can try and give that overview. First of all, just if you look at one of the industries that I'm quite involved in, which is with the fruit export market, we calculated with the help of the WWF the impact of CO2 emissions on different kinds of transport modes. And what we find is when we model the South African railway system, which is a mix between diesel and the electric with not the cleanest electricity in South Africa, we find that the CO2 emissions per ton moved over a kilometer of rail compared to road is a reduction of 90%. So if South Africa wants to make a significant change in terms of reducing its CO2 emissions and reaching the Paris goals that we all subscribe to, rail can play a very big role in that. And that's one of the reasons why you find that road to rail has been added now to the JET IP, the Just Energy Transition investment programs of South Africa. So for South Africa to become competitive, also just to touch on your other part of the question, the whole aspect of using rail must make the logistics system in South Africa in future cheaper, and that is if we can increase the quantum of traffic on the rail and get the unit cost down, and this must be the most significant contributor to the future success of the growth in South Africa, reducing the cost of doing business. We cannot do that by continuing with road freight as it is. Our roads are congested, we don't have space for roads, and most importantly, we don't have space for additional road traffic entering the ports. But we do have space for rail entering the ports, and that's why we need to look at how do we utilize through competition and the open access on the rail network, where many new entrants can come in, the growth of the railway sector that can assist to bring that containers and the domestic palletized traffic onto rail with unique solutions that we require. And that's where the innovation will come from the private sector. Let me just stop there for now. Thanks.
Awesome. So I think just to recap, we have quite a lot of points here. I mean, economic competitiveness and driving down the cost of goods. We also have rail efficiencies or improvements on the infrastructure provided by Stephen. And then we also have, from an environmental perspective, how much we would be avoiding, let's just say, any of the emissions, as well as potential externality costs and the risks of road itself. Yeah. So we can understand that moving towards rail is a pretty important thing. So let's try and contextualize what we want to talk about here. And I wanted to try and separate these two problems just to make it a little bit easier to speak about each one specifically. We have a map which shows us the current rail utilization, but in blue, we have a deficit between what the demand is and what is being used on rail. So we currently have 22% of transport that could have been moved based on current infrastructure from road to rail today. It's a pretty big gap. And at the same time, I think if I had to ask many of the logistics professionals what the issue with rail is, we look at actual infrastructure development. So if the total from the economic, what should be rail friendly, we see, yes, potential infrastructure, potential collaboration issues are preventing us from moving over to a rail network. So let's just separate these two sort of concepts and unpack each one, right? Over the last couple of years, we can see that there has been concerted efforts to try and move from road to rail, where it was somewhat, let's just say it improved by about 5%, has been moved over the last 8 years or somewhat, right? So let's unpack one under rail utilization versus let's call the other one rail density. I think first, let's chat about rail utilization, and I'd really like to get Stephen from Value Logistics perspective on this.
So if we look on an average day, there are about 4,500 containers that are discharged in the port of Durban. Of those 4,500 containers, only about 300 are actually put on rail. The balance is collected from the port. Now you can imagine how many trucks are sitting there to collect these containers. As you alluded to, you have to look at the emissions. It's great. If you just have to park outside that port and you have these trucks idling there all day, it is really bad. Transnet themselves, since the floods in Durban, have really gone out of their way to try increase the amount of trains that are coming up from Durban to Johannesburg, and again have tried to increase the safety on the rail line. Now they have a lot of challenges. The one is theft. Not theft of the cargo, it's theft of the electricity, it's theft of railway sleepers. So they have a lot of challenges. Again, from their side, they have put in a system whereby they have a drone that runs along the railway line, they check it, and if there's a problem, they will then put a steam locomotive in order to pull the containers. So I think from their point of view, they are really trying their best to accommodate. In terms of costing, it's actually cheaper to rail a container than it is to road transport a container, especially when you get heavy containers, especially if you get a heavy 20-foot container. You pay double if it's over 12 tons, whereas if you rail it, you can rail up to 28 tons on a 20-foot container, so there's quite a big saving there as well. So we are really, as I said, a big advocate to change from road to rail. Also, what's really important as well, that the ports themselves are really congested. So to get a container out the port, you need to make an appointment. It can take sometimes 3-4 days to get a container out of the port once it's available. With rail, they will rail the containers as and when they come off the ship. Provided you've notified Transnet that you're going to rail your container 3 days before the container is discharged, it will be put on the first available train. So if people think that road is faster than rail, for now it's definitely not.
Lunga, if I had to just call on you here, I mean, maybe it's a bit of an unfair question, but as a representative of Business Unity South Africa, what would you say are some of the blockers or constraints from getting the private sector to move more from road to rail?
It is an unfair question. Look, there are a number of challenges, and I think a lot of them do lead back to some of the inefficiencies that we spoke about earlier. I think a lot of our members would ideally like to see a situation where they could use or utilize the rail network more efficiently. However, if one looks at the challenges that the current incumbent, which is Transnet, is facing, one gets a sense that it would take a monumental effort to turn that around. So utilization, I think there's a great appetite on the part of the private sector. But what you find is that the Transnet just doesn't have the balance sheet to turn around some of these inefficiencies. So if I can give one glaring example, recently we had a commodity boom about 3-4 years ago, and there was a great call from some of the mining houses for them to put more of their outputs on rail and out of the country. And that was not possible. So we missed out on a major commodity boom because of the inability of Transnet to service some of those clients. And some of those challenges range from a number of things. It's the availability of rolling stock, the timing around delivery, and I think Stephen is touching on some of these things in terms of how efficient some of our ports are. And so it does seem that when private sector actors are faced with those kind of challenges, they will look for solutions in other modes of transportation. Costly as they are a much more efficient and a much more reliable form of transport. And so those things still hinder the system at the moment, but I think a great deal of progress has been made in ensuring that there are certain things that we can do to improve efficiencies, not only on the rail side, but also at our ports. And so there was an attempt, I think, from Transnet, in fact, to start a process of concessioning, for instance, at our ports. And we all know, that came with its own set of problems. And so that is kind of a learning curve. And I think what we have done is put ourselves in a position to say, how is it that we can bring private sector resources and efficiencies to help with that situation?
Got you, 100%. I think, yeah, we're definitely going to unpack a lot of the density or infrastructure-related questions. But I'm going to ask you, given, yes, there currently is a utilization gap, if we can maybe hold it in our minds. Jan, Louis, could I ask that perhaps you respond to some of the sentiment echoed by the private sector, obviously with Lunga as a proxy?
I can definitely try and do that, and Lunga is correct. The private sector do have the appetite and the requirement to get involved and be allowed to assist Transnet in addressing this capital constraint that is sitting on Transnet. We also need to get the focus on utilizing the rail and making sure that we don't just rely on the state-owned entity called Transnet to provide all the capacity for the rail services, but allow the private sector to bring in under regulated access conditions and the regulated access pricing, part of what we're trying to do as IRAC, to get those rules in place by the latest, late this year, in October, that the private sector can start to apply for access onto the rail network. And on that way, we will go a great way of assisting Transnet by bringing in additional traffic on the lines. Those entities will pay access, and by paying the access, they will also then add to the income that's available for Transnet for the maintenance and upgrading of the lines. Just on the densification of the lines, if you look at the potential that's there, just take one of the main corridors in the country, Cape Town up to Gauteng. The rail market share on that specific corridor, I want to say that it's most probably as low as 1%. And that's the corridor where the market share of rail is supposed to be above 80%. Now, it doesn't mean that all the trucks need to stop running tomorrow, but we need to make sure that for the continued linkages between Gauteng and Western Cape, we need to start developing the rail corridor so that the traffic growth can all be accommodated on rail. And that's really what we need to do. On the port side, I don't want to go into the ports, but the port, just as a main, we need the private sector to get involved, but also get interport competition going. We also had, for a very long time, a system in the country that all the container terminals, whether it's Cape Town, Kruger, Port Elizabeth, or Durban, were all under one entity, so that there's not a specific situation today where a shipping line can say, I prefer to call at Port A because I get the best service for this country in South Africa. They just got a mediocre service at the 4 different terminals. And just on that, when Lunga and people speak about getting the private sector involved and getting the port system sorted out, we need to take that into consideration as well. Thanks.
Got you. I'm going to call on Stephen to respond, but once again, I think it was very interesting. Yesterday we did the port competition session, and then the concept of rail came up. Private sector is generally very conservative, fair. So I'm getting a lot of once bitten, twice shy, right? A lot of instances happened maybe before some of the turnaround. And yes, we can all agree the turnaround is relatively recent, right? So as a conservative network, that's fine. But I think what we have here, especially on stage, we have a decent enough use case to unpack. So the question itself, and maybe you can respond to them in line of this, what is needed to move demand to our existing, so not what's the gap in the infrastructure, our existing rail capacity? Stephen.
I think it's important that we get private business involved. We certainly need to get the customers to realize that rail is an option and rail is safe. Just to say, the general feeling is that when you put your cargo on rail, you lose complete control. That's not 100% correct. Containers are put in what they call a bathtub. The containers are sealed. There's a guard force that watches the containers. When they arrive at the terminal, they inspect it to make sure that everything is in place. And so I don't think that is the problem. I don't think there really is a safety problem. Well, certainly. So I think we really have to get more advertising. We need to really get out into the marketplace and get clients to change. I think we always, everybody's scared of change. It's like we are totally resistant to any change. So when we mention to a customer we would like to rail your container, the answer is no.
Yeah.
And then when we try it and it works, then we start to get into that becomes the norm until we get on to our next client, and then we start to go on them as well.
And can you tell me, do you think that this is more of an enablement thing, or is it a branding thing? So enablement in the sense of educating people about...
I think it's education.
Okay.
I really think that's what needs to be done. And again, we do some test cases and show them how it actually works. I'll give you a very good example. Out of the Durban port, there are two ports. The one port you can only collect your containers once the vessel has completed discharge. And then they release them per tier and you need a booking. On rail, they rail immediately. So you can get a rail container sometimes 5 days before you can get your road container. So it's definitely an option that needs to be explored, and it needs some basic education to the importers, to the clearing agents, to the intermodal service providers. And I think what's also important that it would not lead to a loss of jobs, because there is always the last mile. So when a container arrives in the terminal in City Deep or Kazoni, you need someone to move it. So there is an opportunity for transporters to change the way they're working. And I think if you have a look at that Durban to Johannesburg road, the N3, every night there's an accident, at least one way of traffic. It's closed for a couple of hours. Very often it's both ways. So it's not ideal. And certainly with having all these container trucks moving on that N3, it endangers the lives of normal people traveling by car. So it's not ideal.
Lunga, perhaps a response to that?
I'm in agreement with Stephen. As much as I think there needs to be education around what he has described as a viable model, but we also need to bridge what I would call something that's developed lately, which is a trust deficit.
Yes, sir.
Right? So a lot of our members just simply do not trust the current operator to run the system efficiently enough for them to be commercially viable. And so therefore, what we also need, besides just an education, is a bit of goodwill on the part of the operator. They need to show that the system is in a state where it is trustworthy, it is efficient, and it is user-friendly. Outside of that, I think we will still continue to have a problem where a perception does exist that it's not necessarily the most viable intermodal or mode of transportation.
I appreciate that response. I think before we move to rail density, I just want to say, Stephen has made a last-minute concession to be a part of this panel, and I really appreciate his feedback, but he does have to run. So if possible, just a round of applause for your contribution so far.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Nice
much.
meeting you, Stephen.
Hopefully, a lot of the other logistics or freight forwarders can take some cues from the successes of value. Thank you. So, Jan-Louis and Lunga, we're going to continue, and now we're getting to actual, I guess, as you said, change internally is hard to do, whereas we can see where there's improvements needed elsewhere. Gents, can I just ask that you minimize the view of the call-in? So now we speak about rail network density, right? And we definitely see that there has somewhat been a decrease when we're looking at tons per kilometers relative to other countries, and also just the number as an index. We're not as competitive as, for example, we have Canada, USA, Russia, India, China, which are our compatriots. I think Germany, Italy is a bit of an outlier just based on how they're looking at certain options within their space. But let's unpack on the density part itself. And I think we've mentioned it a lot. Jan-Louis, do you have any feedback on some of the actions that Transnet is taking to improve this?
Yes, if I can respond, I think, and the example I want to use is the work that is being done on the line between Johannesburg and Durban, or the so-called container corridor. We had a lot of damage due to the floods that happened about 2 years ago, and that reduced capacity on the line dramatically, and because of that, also for some time, all traffic was stopped. So you find that Transnet is busy restoring the capacity, not to the level I want to see, but at least you will find that in the next 2 months, we will have more than a doubling of capacity, meaning train slots per direction available on that specific line. So the possibility of a quick increase in the amount or the number of trains between Johannesburg and Durban can then really be addressed. But we need that buy-in from the customers. Just to add to that, just remember that when I move a container out of the port of Durban to City Deep, it can move in bond because the clearing can take place in City Deep because that is an inland port. It's a bonded facility. And that's the other advantage. You don't first need to finalize all the issues with SARS before you can start moving the container out of the port of Durban. So on the container corridor, very much active what Transnet is doing. There's also some action on some of the other corridors, unfortunately more focusing on the mining minerals, whether it's the line to Richards Bay or then a lot of action just because of what's happening on the ore line, this Sishen to Saldanha line, where there's activity from Transnet. Still constrained due to affordability issues. Transnet Freight Rail, by not having the turnover that they used to have, being a fixed cost business, pay way too much out in salaries, and not enough is then available to be spent on the spare parts or the replacement rail, replacement sleepers that's required. And that's something we need to address as well with government to say, can there be some very specific short-term interventions or where we can get the private sector involved in the shorter term in concessions or different forms of PPPs or PSPs to actually fix that infrastructure and get the infrastructure capacity back up to what it's supposed to be. That
Awesome.
is what is our big challenge for now. Thanks.
Awesome. I'm actually going to call on you again, Jan-Louis. I think this slide highlights, this is the strategic framework of Transnet to turn their systems around. But I mean, a strategy is only as good as how much is implemented. But it is a good sign that the paradigm itself has been or is changed. So, Jan-Louis, you did mention around capital building and potential partnerships. This was presented on the 28th of May by Russell Baike's senior exec at Transnet. Are you at liberty to speak about the structure and how it could improve density, looking at partnership and improving infrastructure?
I can speak on my behalf, how I interpret what Russell was presenting. And what it is that we will make the assumption that the current level of activity operated by Transnet Freight Rail will at least continue, as well as with the recovery, to again recapture some of that lost tonnage, like on the container corridor or to RBCT. But with that, as we see the private sector entities, and please understand that there's already 5 entities in the country with locomotives and wagons that can theoretically start operating tomorrow, that together with the additional investment coming in, you will find then that this additional train operating companies, those that's indicated in green on the slide, will add to the number of trains that will then add to the amount of money available for the infra manager or the TRIM, Transnet infra manager, to be able to manage the network. Part of what the Department of Transport is also doing is to say, can we go through a process of rail planning to determine what is the economic required network to maintain, that we don't maintain all the networks that's perhaps not needed, or where there's a specific case where a certain line can go out to the private sector for where they can do it better and cheaper than what Transnet is doing, that can be expedited as well. So that is really how I interpret what Russell was explaining in that specific presentation.
100%. I think this was exceptionally important. Maybe, if Lunga, if I can call on you, potentially, what are the specific things you think private sector needs to see from Transnet? So these are all good things that are showing a positive direction, but do you have any potential suggestions?
Look, I think it's clear from the various structural reforms initiatives that are on the go that Transnet will inherently also form part of the broader grouping of rail operating companies. So it will lose its monopoly. And I think some of these structural reforms do call for a vertical separation, which will require, as I said, for Transnet to be an operating company, but at the same time not lose its status as the infrastructure owner. And so for us, I think what's important is for that to happen. That vertical separation is very important because it will provide for a level playing field for private sector players to enter into the space. Because what we don't want is a situation where Transnet is both the referee and the player. So the importance of what Jan-Louis just mentioned now in terms of the infrastructure manager. But I think coupled to that is a sound regulatory framework. There has been a general lack of regulation within this sector for the longest time, and so some of the things that we are seeing coming out from the regulatory space give us a lot of comfort. And one of the things that we would definitely want to see as an immediate priority is the establishment of the Transport Economic Regulator, because that regulator will then set up the framework and the terms and conditions for each and every single player within the network to take part and take up opportunities, and it will foster and speed up the involvement of the private sector. At the moment, there are many bankable projects that we are sitting with, but the problem then becomes to say, where do you feed these into? We cannot necessarily feed them into Transnet, because Transnet at some point will be one of our competitors. And so it's important that there is an institutional arrangement that ensures that there's a statutory body that would look after the regulatory landscape. And I think that will give us much more comfort. And to Jan-Louis' point, I think we have a number of shovel-ready projects. The private sector is ready to invest. There are a number of entities, and he mentioned some of them, about 5, who have the balance sheet, who could tomorrow, should the situation be viable for them, invest it within the rail system itself to provide the kind of capital injection and investment to look at things such as upgrading of infrastructure, how do we crowd in technology, the maintenance of the current infrastructure, and all of those things are important. So to ask the private sector to come in at this stage without the necessary regulatory framework, but also in the current situation in terms of how the infrastructure is managed, I think it will be a tough task for anybody who's looking to enter that space.
Sure. So just to recap, I think from an infrastructural development point of view, we are somewhat limited in the regulatory framework or lack of specifics from Transnet. And it does put private in a bit of a position where they're not as willing as they perhaps want to be. Let's take a step back and maybe look at some global solutions. And I want to bring the concept of freight villages. If we can just touch on this for a little bit. Given that the structure of these freight villages itself may be a bit messy now, based on lack of a confirmed regulator, maybe we can just talk about this as a solution in general, right? So, Jan-Louis, do you have anything to say about a freight village as a concept, and then the lack of these freight villages in South Africa with the potential to bring them across the network?
Yes, let me just first say, I truly believe in the concept of freight villages to crowding development and investment in the country, but also ensure that you have this cross-pollination between companies inside a specific geographical area that all then share a very specific common container terminal, for example, or intermodal terminal. That gives the linkage between the different freight villages in the country and the freight villages and the ports. One of the investments that we are busy with is really on the agricultural space, where it's like a mini freight village connected with the citrus and avocado producers, where we bring in packing facilities, recooling, all the preparation work, the packaging material and the like, so that you can bring that all surrounding a container terminal that gives you then the connection back to the ports. South Africa started with a very good concept called the Special Economic Zones, or the SEZs. And I think what we need to just take forward is to say that can we convert the SEZ into proper freight villages in the future? Meaning that we think about not just the tax benefits of a SEZ, but we look at the logistics, linkages and solutions that is required. And for me, that's the missing part of converting SEZ, whether it's the one in Harrismith called Maloyi into a very specific, focused freight village that can build on the strength of that area, which again is most probably an agricultural business space. But we can do that, we can utilize this. In the bigger Gauteng area, you most probably will find more technological as well as the automotive side, where these freight villages will develop on. But every area in the country can have freight villages based on the strength of this specific community to make sure that we can build industry and grow this economy. But the linkages are extremely important. I just wanted to make a remark, and sorry to do this to you, and that is that we are waiting for the President to sign the transport or the economic regulation of transport bill. It has been passed by Parliament on the 29th of February. It can be signed by the President, hopefully before Friday, and even by the next President, whoever will be elected on Friday, can still sign that. So the preparatory work for the future transport economic regulator for the rail, that is what we are doing on as the IRAC. So the IRAC is busy with the preparatory work to ensure that the minute that the transport economic regulator is established, the process to get rail regulated and allow for that comfort for the private sector, that can be given. I think I just missed that to share that with you in the beginning of the talk. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. So these are pretty good signs. I think one of the main things, sorry guys, one of the main things is I think when we're looking to partner with Transnet, it seems like there's a variety of options. Some of them may not be as fruitful, but it seems like we need to be a little bit more innovative and open to looking at ways in which we can do this. One of these ways I want to highlight for you in this video. Please continue. Yes.
Good afternoon. The oil and chemical company Sasol and Transnet Freight Rail say they're announcing a new public-private partnership that will see Transnet using dedicated ammonia tankers on its rail network. Sasol will pay for the maintenance and repair program for the train.
We've reached quite a groundbreaking agreement with Sasol, and it's a very strategic partnership that allows us to bring back into activity and production some of the wagons that were parked as a result of lack of maintenance. What that will do is it will enable a dedicated service to Sasol to run chemicals that would otherwise have been on road. What Sasol is bringing to the fore in this partnership is we are bringing our old unmaintained wagons, and Sasol is paying for that initial fee, which is quite substantial, to bring these back into production. You must recall that these type of wagons are quite specialized in nature and require an elaborate maintenance regime. And so what Sasol has put on the table, which we've negotiated and gladly concluded, is a maintenance regime that they will take over, meaning therefore that commercially we then would give them a dispensation through pricing that enables them to then take up the ownership of maintenance, and we run the service as per normal.
Okay, so that's a potential interesting opportunity. What I'm going to do is I want to open up, we don't have a lot of time, but I would just love to hear from you guys, given that we have the experience that we do on stage. Are there any questions for our panelists, Jan-Louis and Lunga? Do we have a mic, please? Oh, we have a couple. That's great. Please feel free. One in front, but there's also a lady in the center. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Humain from Maersk. So one of the challenges we've been having is, and we've been trying to migrate a lot of our clients to rail, but even with the reduction in cost, and we've worked, if you take Durban, Johannesburg, for example, around 30 to 40%, depending on the weight band, less in cost as opposed to road. However, the lead time is not in line. So we don't say it's a delay because it is rail, and it does take a bit longer, but we've been looking at about 12 days from Durban Port to Johannesburg. So while we want to try and push customers to go that route, it's not worth the return on investment to move to rail because of the lead time. Especially if you look at food and bev, FMCG, retail, lifestyle, those kind of customers, they're quite opposed to it because of that long lead time. So how would you propose pushing this to clients where lead time is quite an issue, however they are aware of the benefits in terms of cost, CO2 emissions, and the rest?
Awesome question. I think, Jan-Louis, if I can potentially ask you to wear your ex-Transnet hat and perhaps give us a potential pitch, if that's the best word.
Yeah, perhaps just to start, we're sitting today with a problem in Transnet just because of the condition of the track, which is now being fixed, where the running time of the trains are very slow and with limited capacity. We hope to see that we can get back to the service levels that used to operate between Johannesburg and Durban, where container trains used to traverse that line after departing from the port and arriving into City Deep of 18 to 20 hours. And I think that will be possible very soon. If I say very soon, hopefully within the next year. So that will start to address the long lead times that Maersk is talking about. But I also just want to perhaps give a very specific example, and there's many of the boxes that Maersk is actually shipping on that, and that is that there's a citrus train from Bella Bella, the old Warmbad, running with citrus. I think it's now 4 times or 5 times a week to the port of Durban. And you find that citrus being loaded in Marble Hall, being railed from Bella Bella into the port of Durban with nearly 100% success rate and the transfer time already of less than 45 hours at most for those specific trains. In future, the hope is that the transfer time for those trains can again be less than 30 hours. So there's very good examples and good successes already being indicated on rail. And this is what we need to build up. And that this is, again, where private sector and Transnet needs to collaborate. Let's get the focus on what the priorities must be so that we can expedite the fixing of the network and, again, speeding up the velocity of the trains. Not the speed when they run, but the velocity, which includes limiting all the times that they stop, waiting and not moving. Thanks.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Thanks. So I've always questioned my shipping manager, why are we not moving containers via rail? So we've actually done that. One of the challenges there were a few challenges experienced. Firstly, we had to have a minimum of 50 containers. You don't want to bring that amount of containers on one ship because of delays. So it's not only the railway that we need to talk about and consider. It's an end-to-end supply chain, and what is the impact on the retailer or the organization? Secondly, you're actually creating future bottlenecks. Where you have a capacity of your facility to maybe turn 40 containers in a shift, you are now creating these ebbs and flows, which means that you require a container depot. Many of the container depots I've been dealing with in South Africa, the level of expertise, AI, systems, is almost non-existent. Most of the time that I go visit these depots, the guy remembers where he put the last box, or it's being managed on Excel. Over the last few years, so there's so many components within the conversion or transformation that will be required that I think we shouldn't only look at the infrastructure. And I'm not sure where's your thoughts on that, and how is that level of engagement happening with the private sector?
I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
Maybe if I just had to try and pose that to you, Lunga, how can private sector help in economic policy development as it relates to, is there any way that we could have some say or some influence, even if it's just flagging that these are the concerns from Transnet's potential constituents?
Yeah, look, I think you make a valid point. There was not so much of a question there, but really an observation. And your observation is 100% true, because one of the things that we've said constantly to our government counterparts is that this needs a holistic approach, right? So, to your point, don't just concentrate on fixing rail, it needs to be holistic, you need to look at ports, et cetera, so the entire kind of value chain that you spoke of. The question around how do we then begin to shape policy, we have proactively as BUSA done that. We have a platform called B4SA, which I mentioned earlier on. And so the work that we're doing around the crisis in the logistics sector is purely driven proactively by business, because we identified 3 focal areas that we thought that we could partner with government on to bring about immediate interventions to address some of the challenges, namely energy, logistics, and crime and corruption. And so the work that we're doing on logistics, for instance, and some of the wins that we have attained through a PSP framework or a freight logistics roadmap, all of those things have been a result of a proactive private sector organized business initiative. And so under those kind of initiatives, we have taken a proactive step to say, how do we begin to shape policy that is informed by the needs of the private sector, but also the overall developmental needs of the country? And so we've been able to find each other in that kind of sense. And so instead of waiting for these things to take shape, and I think John-Louis made a very interesting point around the bill that's currently sitting with the presidency, we've gone on a very active lobbying drive with the presidency to say, we need this bill to be signed as in yesterday, because this will be the one thing that will enable us really to then start to unpack the power of the private sector in terms of bringing in resources and skills to turn the situation around in the sector.
Amazing. Guys, I think we're going to call it on that note. I want to say thank you to the audience, but also to our participants. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Jan-Louis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.